The biting wind howled a mournful dirge across the desolate platform of the Redemption Gulch train station, a place usually bustling with the chaotic symphony of arrival and departure, now eerily silent beneath the oppressive weight of a cruel, unseasonal blizzard. Snow, sharp as shattered glass, whipped through the air, painting the rough-hewn timbers of the station house in a ghostly white. It was a night when sensible folk were huddled by their fires, a night when the very elements seemed intent on scouring life from the harsh landscape. Yet, it was on this very night that Elias Thorne, owner of the sprawling Thorncrest Ranch, a man whose heart, though shadowed by a quiet sorrow, still beat with a fierce and unwavering sense of justice, found himself drawn to the deserted station. He'd come into town for supplies, delayed by the sudden ferocity of the storm, and a gnawing unease, an inexplicable premonition, had pulled him towards the lonely depot as he prepared to ride out. His horse, Titan, a magnificent black stallion, snorted uneasily, its breath pluming white in the frigid air, sensing perhaps the grim discovery that lay ahead. And there, huddled in the scant shelter of a baggage cart half buried by drifting snow, was a sight that would forever sear itself into Elias's memory and send a tremor of outrage through his very soul. It was a girl, or rather, the fragile outline of one, barely discernible beneath a tattered, threadbare shawl that offered no real protection against the storm's icy talons. Her skin, where it peeked through the pitiful garment, was a terrifying, waxy blue, her hair, the color of midnight, matted with ice and snow. She was so still, so utterly lifeless, that for a horrifying moment Elias thought he was too late, that the unforgiving wilderness had already claimed another victim. He swung down from Titan, his spurred boots crunching on the frozen ground, his weathered face, usually a mask of stoic composure, etched with a raw, immediate concern that bordered on anguish. This was not the frontier he knew, the one that demanded strength and resilience. This was a cruelty of a different, more insidious kind, a human failing that left a bitter taste in his mouth. He knelt, his gloved hand gently brushing snow from her face. Her eyelids, fringed with frozen lashes, fluttered almost imperceptibly. A shallow, ragged breath escaped her cracked lips, a tiny flag of defiance against the encroaching frost. She was alive, but only just, hanging on to existence by the slenderest of threads. Anger, cold and sharp, pierced through Elias's initial shock, anger at whoever had abandoned this child, for she looked no older than 18, if that, to such a cruel fate. It was an act of such profound callousness it beggared belief. He looked around the deserted platform, his gaze sweeping the darkened windows of the station house, searching for any sign, any clue, but there was nothing, only the relentless howl of the wind and the suffocating blanket of white. This wasn't just an accident of travel, this felt deliberate, a casting off, an abandonment so complete it was tantamount to a death sentence. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this moment, this discovery, was a fulcrum upon which his life, and hers, would pivot. What he did next wouldn't just be about saving a life, it would be a declaration, a stand against the casual barbarity that sometimes festered in the shadows of progress and prosperity. The town of Redemption Gulch, nestled in the valley below his ranch, was a place of decent folk, but it was also a place where whispers traveled faster than a prairie fire and judgment could be as swift and harsh as the winter wind. He knew his actions would be scrutinized, dissected, perhaps even condemned by some. But as he looked at the fragile, frozen girl, a fierce protectiveness surged through him, eclipsing any concern for societal opinion. This was not about them. This was about her. This was about right and wrong, a simple, unshakable tenet that had guided him through the loss of his own beloved Mary and their infant son years ago, a loss that had carved a lonely canyon in his heart but had never extinguished the flame of his compassion. He carefully, tenderly gathered the girl into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, like a bird with broken wings, and her body was rigid with cold. He unfastened his own thick, sheepskin-lined coat, the biting air instantly assaulting his own warmth, and wrapped it around her, cocooning her in its life-giving heat. Her head lolled against his chest, a faint, almost inaudible sigh escaping her lips as some minute measure of warmth seeped into her frozen limbs. He carried her to Titan, who stood patiently, his intelligent eyes fixed on his master. Mounting with his precious, fragile burden was awkward, but Elias managed, settling her securely in front of him, her head resting against his shoulder. He pulled the edges of his coat tighter around her, shielding her as best he could from the storm's relentless assault. As he urged Titan forward, away from the desolate station and into the swirling snow towards the distant sanctuary of Thorncrest, a single, resolute thought echoed in his mind: he would not let her perish. He would fight for her life, and if she survived, he would fight for her future. The whole town might be shocked, they might whisper and conjecture, but Elias Thorne knew one thing: he was doing what had to be done. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The storm raged around them, a furious, elemental beast, but within the circle of his arms a tiny spark of life, so nearly extinguished, was being painstakingly, determinately coaxed back from the brink. The journey ahead would be arduous, not just the physical trek through the snow, but the emotional journey of healing and trust should she survive. But Elias was no stranger to difficult paths. He was a rancher, a man of the land, accustomed to nurturing life from unyielding soil, and he would pour every ounce of his strength and compassion into this unexpected, desperate, and sacred charge. The station faded behind them, a monument to indifference, as Elias Thorne rode into the tempest, carrying a frozen girl and a future yet unwritten. The ascent to Thorn Crest Ranch was a battle against the elements, each gust of wind a physical blow, each drift of snow a treacherous obstacle. Elias held the girl close, her slight frame a constant, chilling reminder of the life teetering on the precipice within his embrace. Titan, sure-footed and powerful, navigated the winding, snow-choked trail with an almost preternatural awareness, as if he too understood the urgency of their mission. The lights of the ranch house, usually a welcoming beacon, were faint, diffused by the swirling blizzard, but they represented warmth, safety, and hope, everything this frozen child had been denied. Martha, his housekeeper, a woman whose kindness was as boundless as the Montana sky, would be waiting. She was the bedrock of his home, a steady, comforting presence since Mary's passing, and Elias knew her capable hands and compassionate heart were exactly what was needed. As they finally reached the sprawling porch of the main house, the wind seemed to lessen its fury, or perhaps it was merely the shelter of the sturdy log walls. Jebediah, his foreman, a man of few words but unwavering loyalty, emerged from the stables, his face etched with concern as he saw the state of his employer and the still, small form in his arms. "Mr. Thorne, what in tarnation?" Jebediah's voice, usually a low rumble, was sharp with alarm. Elias dismounted carefully, his limbs stiff with cold and the strain of holding the girl. "Get Titan settled, Jeb, and tell one of the hands to ride for Doc Miller as soon as the worst of this breaks. Tell him it's urgent, life or death." He didn't wait for a reply, already moving towards the heavy oak door, kicking it open with his boot. The warmth of the house washed over them, a stark contrast to the frozen hell outside. Martha, alerted by the commotion, appeared from the kitchen, a rolling pin still in her flour-dusted hand, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock and then to a deep, maternal concern as she took in the scene. "Lord have mercy, Elias. What child is this?" Her voice was a hushed whisper, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and pity. Elias gently laid the girl on the thick bearskin rug before the massive stone fireplace, where a fire roared, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Found her at the station, Martha. Abandoned." Nearly frozen solid, his voice was grim, the earlier anger now tempered by a weary determination. Martha was instantly by the girl's side, her years of practical wisdom taking over. "Get these wet things off her, quickly now. We need to warm her slowly." Too fast can be as dangerous as the cold itself. Together, they worked with a practiced efficiency born of shared purpose. Martha's touch was gentle yet firm as she and Elias carefully removed the girl's tattered, ice-encrusted rags, revealing a body shockingly emaciated, her skin marred by bruises that spoke of a cruelty beyond mere neglect. A faint, almost invisible silver locket lay against her collarbone, its surface too tarnished to discern any inscription. Martha clucked her tongue, a sound of profound sorrow and indignation. "The poor lamb. What kind of monster would do such a thing?" Elias shook his head, his jaw tight. "I don't know, Martha. But I aim to find out." He brought warm blankets, heated by the fire, while Martha prepared a weak, warm broth. They chafed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, their movements careful, their voices low and soothing, though the girl remained unconscious, lost in some deep, frozen recess of her mind. Hours passed in this way, a vigil kept by the fireside. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the walls of Thorn Crest, a silent battle for life was being waged. Elias watched the girl's face, pale and still as marble, wondering about the story hidden behind those closed eyelids, the pain etched in the delicate lines around her mouth. Who was she? Where did she come from? And who could have left her to die in such a desolate place? The town of Redemption Gulch was already a distant concern, but Elias knew that by morning, when the storm hopefully abated, word would begin to spread. A stranger, a near-dead girl, brought to the widower Thorne's isolated ranch. It was ripe fodder for gossip and speculation. Some would be sympathetic, others suspicious. He'd lived a solitary life for so long, finding solace in the rhythms of the ranch, his interactions with the townsfolk polite but reserved. This act, this bringing of an unknown, broken soul into the heart of his home, would undoubtedly shatter that carefully constructed peace. But looking at the girl, so vulnerable, so utterly dependent on their care, he felt no regret, only a deepening resolve. Martha, ever practical, had also started to consider the implications. When she wakes, Elias, if the good Lord wills it, she'll be frightened. We need to be gentle. Her gaze met his, full of an unspoken understanding. She had been with him through his darkest days, and her loyalty was a comfort beyond measure. We will be, Martha, Elias assured her. She'll find nothing but kindness here. As dawn approached, the blizzard began to lose its ferocity, the wind's howl softening to a mournful sigh. The girl stirred. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. A flicker of an eyelash. A shallow intake of breath that was slightly less ragged than before. A sliver of hope, fragile but persistent, entered the warm room. Elias leaned closer, his heart thudding. He placed a hand gently on her forehead. It was still cold, but not the deathly chill of before. She's fighting, he murmured. A sense of profound relief washing over him. Martha nodded, a weary smile touching her lips. She's got spirit, that one. You can see it. Even now, the first rays of pale morning light, filtered through snow-laden windows, cast a soft glow on the scene. The storm outside was passing, leaving behind a world transformed, blanketed in pristine white. Inside Thorn Crest, another transformation was slowly, painstakingly beginning, the thawing of a frozen girl and perhaps the further thawing of a lonely rancher's heart. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now she was safe. That was all that mattered. The whispers of the town could wait. The following days at Thorn Crest Ranch unfolded with a hushed reverence, the entire household moving with a quiet solicitude centered around the girl in the guest room. Doc Miller had arrived as soon as the trails were passable, his weathered face grim as he examined their patient. He was a man of science and pragmatism, not given to overt displays of emotion, but even he had shaken his head in disbelief at the state she'd been found in. Hypothermia, severe malnutrition, exhaustion, and these bruises, Thorn, they ain't from any fall. His gaze had been pointed. Someone's been systematically cruel to this child. He'd offered little hope initially, praising Elias and Martha for their quick actions, which had undoubtedly saved her life, but warning them that the path to recovery would be long and fraught with potential complications. The girl, whom Martha had taken to calling Elara after a wildflower that bloomed resiliently in harsh conditions, remained mostly unconscious for the first 2 days, drifting in a twilight realm between life and oblivion. Martha rarely left her side, coaxing spoonfuls of warm broth between her lips, bathing her fevered brow, and speaking to her in soft, soothing tones, recounting simple stories of the ranch, of playful kittens and newborn calves, weaving a tapestry of gentle sounds into the silence of the room. Elias found himself drawn to the doorway often, watching Martha's ministrations, his heart aching with a mixture of pity for the girl and a simmering anger towards her unseen tormentors. He saw glimpses of his lost Mary in Martha's gentle care, a bittersweet pang that reminded him of the love that had once filled his life and the profound emptiness left in its wake. He had built Thorn Crest with Mary, their dreams woven into its very timbers. After her and their sons passing from a fever that swept through the valley, the ranch had become his sole purpose, a legacy of hard work but also a constant, silent reminder of his solitude. Now, this fragile stranger had been thrust into his world, a flicker of vulnerability that somehow made the large house feel less empty. On the third day, Elara's eyes opened. They were a startling shade of violet, shadowed and vast in her pale, thin face and filled with a raw, animal fear. When she saw Elias standing in the doorway, a tall, imposing figure, terror flashed across her features and she tried to shrink away, a small, choked sound escaping her lips. Martha immediately intervened, placing a comforting hand on Elara's arm. "Hush now, child. You're safe here. This is Mr. Thorn. He's the one who found you, who brought you out of the storm." Elara's gaze darted from Martha to Elias, her eyes wide and unblinking, like a startled fawn. Elias kept his distance, his voice gentle when he spoke. "Welcome back to the living, miss. You gave us quite a scare." He offered a small, reassuring smile, but her fear remained palpable. He retreated, understanding that his presence might be too overwhelming for her in her fragile state. He knew trust, if it were to come at all, would need to be earned, cultivated slowly like a delicate seedling. The town of Redemption Gulch, as expected, was abuzz. Jebediah brought back tales from his infrequent trips for supplies. Whispers ranged from Elias having a long-lost daughter to him having taken in a mail-order bride who'd nearly perished en route, to darker, more insidious rumors that he was harboring a fugitive. Elias ignored them. His focus was singular, Elara's well-being. He instructed Martha to spare no expense in ensuring her comfort and to purchase new clothes for her in town, simple, modest dresses, warm shawls, and sturdy shoes. The tattered rags she'd arrived in had been burned, a symbolic cleansing of a past he could only guess at. Slowly, painstakingly, Elara began to recover physically. The bruises faded, color returned to her cheeks, and she started to take a little more food. But her spirit remained deeply wounded. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in monosyllables, her voice barely a whisper. She flinched at sudden movements or loud noises, and her eyes held a permanent shadow of fear. Martha was her constant companion, her gentle patience a balm to Elara's frightened soul. She would sit by Elara's bed, knitting or mending, her presence a quiet reassurance. She never pressed Elara for information, never asked about her past, simply offering a safe space for her to heal. Elias continued to keep a respectful distance, making his presence known but not intrusive. He would inquire after her health through Martha, and sometimes he would leave a small offering outside her door, a freshly picked apple from the orchard, a pretty wildflower he'd found on his rides. These small gestures were his way of communicating his care without overwhelming her. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her demeanor from Martha's reports, a day when she ate a little more, a night when she slept without nightmares, a rare moment when a flicker of something other than fear crossed her face. Each tiny step forward was a victory. The silver locket she wore was a mystery. Martha had gently cleaned it, revealing a faded etching of a soaring bird on one side, but it refused to open, its clasp fused shut by time or damage. Elara would clutch it sometimes in her sleep, her only visible link to a life before the storm. The sanctuary of Thorn Crest was slowly enveloping her, its rhythms of honest work, quiet evenings, and the gentle care of its inhabitants a stark contrast to whatever horrors she had endured. The development of trust was a fragile seed, planted in the barren ground of her trauma, and Elias knew it would require infinite patience and unwavering kindness to nurture it into bloom. He was prepared to give both. He had saved her from the storm, now he hoped he could help her find her way back to herself. Weeks turned into a month, and the harsh winter began to grudgingly yield to the tentative promise of spring. Patches of green appeared on the thawing land, and the icy grip on the rivers loosened, their waters once again flowing free. A similar, almost imperceptible thawing was occurring within Elara. She was still quiet, reserved, her eyes often clouded with a distant sorrow, but the raw terror that had initially consumed her was slowly receding, replaced by a watchful fragility. She had begun to venture out of her room, first only as far as the main living area, where she would sit by the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of the ranch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sheer scale of the landscape, the rolling hills giving way to distant, snow-capped mountains, seemed to both intimidate and fascinate her. Martha, with her unfailing intuition, encouraged these small explorations. She would leave a book of pressed flowers on the table or a basket of mending nearby, simple, unassuming invitations for Elara to engage with the world around her at her own pace. Elias, too, adapted his routines. He made a point of being present but not overbearing. He would greet her softly in the mornings, his voice calm and steady, and share brief, non-intrusive snippets about the ranch, a new foal born in the stables, the progress of the spring planting. He spoke of the land with a deep affection, his words painting pictures of its beauty and its challenges, and sometimes he would catch her listening intently, a flicker of curiosity in her violet eyes. He learned that sudden movements still startled her, that direct eye contact for too long made her uneasy. So he moved with a deliberate slowness in her presence, his gaze often indirect, resting on the fire or the view from the window as he spoke. He was treading carefully on the delicate ground of her shattered trust, aware that a single misstep could send her retreating back into her shell. One afternoon, Martha found Elara in the kitchen, tentatively touching a bowl of freshly risen bread dough. Martha, without missing a beat, smiled warmly. "Thinking of trying your hand, dearie? There's a magic to bread making, a comfort in the feel of it." Elara didn't reply, but she didn't pull away either. Martha gently showed her how to knead the dough, her gnarled hands moving with a familiar grace. Elara watched, then hesitantly mimicked the motion. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Elara's lips as she worked the dough, the first genuine smile Elias or Martha had seen from her. It was a fleeting expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was a beacon of hope. He wanted her to understand that Thorn Crest was more than just a place. It was a legacy of perseverance and hope. He noticed she was particularly drawn to the animals. One day, he found her near the corral, watching the horses with a quiet intensity. Titan, usually aloof with strangers, approached the fence, nudging his velvety nose towards her outstretched hand. Elara flinched initially, then, slowly, tentatively, reached out and stroked his muzzle. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder transformed her face, softening the harsh lines of fear and sorrow. Elias watched from a distance, his heart swelling. "He likes you," he said softly, approaching slowly. "He doesn't take to everyone like that." Elara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "He's beautiful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was one of the longest sentences she had spoken to him directly. "He is," Elias agreed. "Strong, loyal, and gentle. When he trusts you." He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the parallel. She confirmed it one evening, a quiet yes, when Martha had used the name. But beyond that, her past remained a locked room, the silver locket her only key, and it remained stubbornly closed. Elias never pressed. He understood that some doors could only be opened from the inside when the occupant felt safe enough to emerge. The townsfolk's curiosity hadn't entirely abated, but Doc Miller's gruff pronouncements about the girl's ordeal and Martha's fierce protectiveness when she went to town for supplies had dampened some of the more malicious gossip. Most now viewed Elias's actions with a grudging respect, or at least a cautious neutrality. Thorncrest was becoming Elara's world, a sanctuary where the rhythms of life were predictable and kind, where the voices were soft and the hands were gentle. The shadows hadn't vanished entirely from her eyes, but they were no longer all-consuming. Sometimes Elias would catch a glimpse of the spirited young woman who lay dormant beneath the layers of trauma, a spark of defiance, a flash of intelligence, a hint of a smile that promised a spring yet to fully arrive. He was patient. He would wait. For he was beginning to realize that in rescuing Elara he was also, in some small way, rescuing a part of himself, a part he thought had been lost forever in the lonely canyon of his grief. The quiet adjustment was a slow dance, a careful choreography of kindness and patience, and slowly, tentatively, trust was beginning to take root. As the warmth of late spring settled over Thorncrest, coaxing vibrant wildflowers from the meadows and painting the landscape in hues of emerald and gold, a corresponding warmth began to unfurl within Elara. The deep, abiding fear that had once held her captive was slowly loosening its grip, making way for a hesitant curiosity about the world around her and the people who inhabited her sanctuary. She began to speak more freely, her voice, though still soft, gaining a new measure of confidence. She would ask Martha questions about recipes or inquire about the names of the wildflowers Elias sometimes brought her. To Elias she might offer a quiet observation about the weather or the behavior of the animals. These small utterances were like precious jewels, marking milestones on her journey towards healing. Elias, in turn, found himself sharing more of his own life with her. He spoke of Mary, his late wife, not with the raw grief of fresh loss, but with a tender reminiscence, describing her love for the ranch, her laughter, her kindness. He found that speaking of Mary to Elara didn't deepen his sorrow, but rather it felt like honoring her memory, sharing the best parts of himself. Elara would listen silently, her violet eyes filled with an empathetic understanding that belied her youth. It was as if her own suffering had carved within her a profound capacity for compassion. He never pried into her past, but one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors, Elara spoke, unprompted. "The locket," she said, her fingers tracing the outline of the small silver pendant at her throat. "It was my mother's." Elias turned to her, his expression gentle, encouraging. "She said it would keep me safe." A shadow crossed her face. It didn't always work. It was a small offering, a glimpse into the locked room of her history, and Elias received it with the reverence it deserved. "Sometimes," he said softly, "safety comes in unexpected forms, from unexpected places." He hoped she understood his meaning, that Thorncrest and the people within it were now part of her safety. Elara began to find small ways to contribute to the running of the household beyond her help in the kitchen. She developed a knack for gardening, tending to Martha's herb patch and the small vegetable garden with a quiet diligence. The physical work, the connection to the earth, seemed to ground her. She would spend hours there, weeding, watering, her brow furrowed in concentration, and sometimes Elias would see her talking softly to the plants, a secret conversation between kindred spirits. Her connection with Titan, the stallion, deepened. Elias, seeing her gentle way with the animal, began to teach her about horses, their care, their temperament. He showed her how to groom Titan, how to speak to him in the low, reassuring tones he understood. He even, cautiously, helped her to sit atop the massive horse while he led him slowly around the corral. The first time she did so, a genuine, unbridled laugh escaped her lips, a sound so pure and joyous that it made Elias's heart ache with a protective tenderness. It was a sound he hadn't realized he'd longed to hear. He also began to see flashes of her spirit, the resilience that had kept her alive through unimaginable hardship. One day, a traveling peddler, a boorish and overly familiar man, stopped at the ranch. He directed some unwelcome pleasantries towards Elara. his eyes lingering too long. Before Elias could intervene, Elara drew herself up to her full, though slight, height, and fixed the man with a gaze so cold and direct that he visibly faltered. "You will address me with respect, sir, or not at all," she stated, her voice quiet but firm as steel. The peddler, taken aback, mumbled an apology and quickly concluded his business, casting nervous glances at the seemingly demure young woman. Elias had watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. The frightened fawn was finding her strength. The town of Redemption Gulch continued its distant hum. Elias had made it clear, through Doc Miller and his own infrequent but pointed interactions, that Elara was under his protection and that her past was her own business. Most had accepted this, particularly as they saw the gradual, positive changes in her whenever Martha brought her to town for necessary errands. The haunted look was slowly being replaced by a quiet composure, and the town's seamstress, Mrs. Peterson, a kind woman, had commented to Martha on Elara's gentle manners and inherent grace. But Elias knew that the world beyond Thorncrest was not always so understanding. He knew that the past, whatever horrors it held, had a long shadow, and he couldn't shield Elara from it forever. For now, however, the ranch was their haven. The long summer days were filled with the peaceful rhythms of work and shared moments. Evenings were often spent on the porch, Elias reading aloud from a book of poetry or a well-worn novel, Martha knitting, and Elara listening, her hands often busy with some small mending task. A quiet camaraderie had developed between them, a chosen family forged in the crucible of crisis and nurtured by kindness. Elias found himself looking forward to these evenings, to Elara's quiet presence, to the subtle signs of her growing trust, a shared glance, a soft smile, a moment when she would unconsciously lean slightly closer to hear his words. He was careful not to misinterpret these signs, to rush her, or to impose his own desires or expectations upon her. His primary concern was her healing, her well-being. But he couldn't deny the profound impact she was having on his own life. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years was receding, replaced by a sense of purpose that extended beyond the fences of his land. He was a protector, a guardian, and in that role he found a renewed sense of self. The trust between them was no longer a fragile seedling but a young sapling, its roots slowly, surely, taking hold in the fertile ground of Thorncrest. And as it grew, it brought with it the promise of shade, of shelter, and perhaps, one day, of blossoming. The golden days of late summer transitioned into the crisp, burnished hues of autumn. The air grew sharp with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the rhythms of Thorncrest shifted towards preparations for the coming winter, a winter Elara would face not in frozen desolation but surrounded by warmth and care. Her transformation continued to be a quiet miracle. The pinched, haunted look that had defined her features upon her arrival had softened, revealing a delicate beauty that was as much a reflection of her inner strength as her physical attributes. Her violet eyes, once wide with perpetual fear, now held a thoughtful, observant quality and often a gentle light when she smiled. And she smiled more often now, genuine smiles that reached her eyes and warmed the hearts of Elias and Martha. Elara had found her niche on the ranch, a sense of purpose that seemed to bloom within her. She had a particular affinity for the more vulnerable creatures the orphaned lamb Jebediah had brought in, which she nursed with devoted patience, the timid barn kittens she coaxed into trust with soft words and offerings of milk. It was as if her own experience of suffering had endowed her with a unique empathy for the fragile and the overlooked. Elias often found her in the small barn, humming softly as she tended to her charges, a picture of quiet contentment. He encouraged her interests, providing her with books on animal husbandry and herbal remedies, which she devoured with a keen intelligence. He saw in her not just a survivor, but a woman of considerable intellect and innate capability. One afternoon, he found her sketching in an old ledger he'd given her, using a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She was drawing Titan, capturing his noble spirit with surprising skill. When she noticed him, she blushed and tried to hide the drawing, but Elias gently stopped her. "That's remarkable, Elara," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have a gift." She looked down, a shy smile playing on her lips. "It's just something I do. To remember things. Good things." Her words, simple as they were, spoke volumes. She was actively choosing to focus on the good, to create new, positive memories to overlay the old, painful ones. This conscious effort towards healing filled Elias with a profound respect for her resilience. The town of Redemption Gulch had, for the most part, settled into a kind of benign acceptance of Elara's presence at Thorncrest. Martha, on her trips to town, would proudly recount Elara's progress, her skill in the garden, her gentle way with animals, her quiet industry. Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress, had become a particular ally, always inquiring kindly after Elara and often sending small gifts of ribbon or thread. Doc Miller, too, remained a staunch supporter, his gruff pronouncements effectively silencing any lingering, ill-natured gossip. He would occasionally visit the ranch, ostensibly to check on Elias's old leg injury from a long-ago cattle drive, but always finding time for a quiet word with Elara, his keen eyes assessing her continued recovery. He pronounced himself well pleased with her progress, telling Elias, "You've done more for that girl than medicine ever could, Thorn." Kindness is a powerful tonic, yet, despite the peace that had settled over them, Elias couldn't shake a persistent undercurrent of unease. Elara's past remained a shadowed landscape, unexplored and unspoken. The silver locket, still clasped and unyielding, was a constant reminder of that unknown history. He knew that such profound trauma as she had clearly endured rarely stayed buried forever. Sometimes he would see a fleeting expression of terror cross her face at an unexpected sound, or find her staring into the distance, her eyes dark with memories she didn't share. These moments were a stark reminder that their sanctuary, however strong, might one day be breached. One crisp October evening, as a chill wind whistled around the eaves of the ranch house, a stranger rode into Redemption Gulch. He was a tall, lean man, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in the rustic town, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He asked quiet questions at the saloon, then at the general store, inquiries about a young woman, dark-haired, possibly traveling alone, who might have passed through some months back. He mentioned no name, offered no reason for his search, but his eyes, cold and assessing, unnerved those he spoke to. News of the stranger and his inquiries traveled slowly, as such things do, but eventually it reached Jebediah, who related to Elias with a worried frown. "Doesn't sound like anyone I know, Mr. Thorne." But he was asking about a girl, a young 1-inch. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but the description, vague as it was too close for comfort. He said nothing to Elara, not wanting to frighten her without cause, but he found himself watching her more closely, a heightened sense of protectiveness surging through him. He also began to ride the perimeter of his property more frequently, his rifle always close at hand, his senses on high alert. A few days later, Elara was helping Martha bring in apples from the small orchard near the house. She paused, her basket half full, and looked towards the main road leading to the ranch, a distant frown creasing her brow. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Martha, whose hearing wasn't what it once was, shook her head. "Hear what, dearie?" "Hoofbeats," Elara whispered, her eyes wide, a flicker of the old fear returning. A single rider, coming fast. Elias, who had been mending a fence nearby, had heard it too. He straightened, his gaze sharp and focused on the road. A lone rider was indeed approaching, moving with a confident, almost arrogant, speed. As the figure drew closer, Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. There was something in the man's posture, in the way he sat his horse, that bespoke a ruthless determination. The stranger reined in his horse a short distance from the orchard, his gaze sweeping over the scene, lingering for a moment too long on Elara. He was dressed in dark, well-tailored clothes, his face clean-shaven, his features sharp and unyielding. His eyes, the color of cold steel, met Elias's. Elara gasped, a small, terrified sound, and dropped her basket, apples scattering across the grass. She took an involuntary step back, her hand flying to the locket at her throat. Her face, moments before rosy from the autumn air, was now ashen. The blood drained from it, leaving her looking like the frozen girl he had found at the station. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be." The stranger dismounted, his movements fluid and precise. A cruel, knowing smile touched his lips as his gaze fixed on Elara. Well, he said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with an undeniable menace. "Fancy finding you here, Elara. Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" The shadow from the past had arrived, casting its cold, dark pall over the sanctuary of Thorncrest. The stranger's voice, though not loud, cut through the crisp autumn air like a whip crack, each word laden with a chilling possessiveness. Elara stood frozen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. The vibrant life that had so painstakingly returned to her face in the preceding months was extinguished in an instant, replaced by the ashen mask of her deepest nightmares. This was him. The source of her scars, both visible and invisible. The architect of her suffering. Silas Blackwood. Elias stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Elara and the newcomer. His own face was a grim, unreadable mask, but his eyes, fixed on Blackwood, held a dangerous glint. "This is private property, Mr. Elias stated, his voice low and steady, a warning rumble beneath the calm. "State your business and then be on your way." Blackwood's thin lips curled into a smirk. He exuded an air of arrogant authority, as if the entire world were his to command. His gaze flickered dismissively over Elias, then returned to Alara, a predatory gleam in his cold eyes. "My business," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "My business is with her. Alara, my dear, you've caused me a great deal of trouble." "A great deal of expense." Alara flinched as if struck. She seemed to shrink into herself, her hand still clutching the locket at her throat as if it were her only shield against this encroaching darkness. Martha, who had been watching with growing alarm, moved to Alara's side, her sturdy presence a small bastion of defiance. "Now see here, you," Martha began, her voice trembling with indignation. "You'll not frighten this child." Blackwood barely spared Martha a glance. "Stay out of this, old woman. This is a private matter between me and my ward." The word ward was uttered with such a proprietary sneer that it made Elias's blood run cold. He knew with a sickening certainty that Blackwood's claim, whatever its nature, was rooted in cruelty and exploitation. "Alara is under my protection," Elias stated, his voice hardening, the quiet authority in his tone unmistakable. "She's a guest in my home. And you are not welcome here." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Your protection? How quaint. I hold the papers, rancher. Legal documents. She belongs to me. An indentured agreement, signed and sealed. Her late father, a feckless drunk, signed her over to my care and her services until she comes of age, and then some to repay his debts." He patted a breast pocket as if the documents themselves were a weapon. "She ran away. Stole from me, in fact. I've been searching for her for months." Alara finally found her voice, though it was choked with tears and terror. "He's lying. My father would never. He treated me like a slave. He starved me, beat me." Her words tumbled out, a torrent of desperate revelation. "Silence, girl." Blackwood snapped, his smooth facade cracking for a moment to reveal the viciousness beneath. "You'll speak when spoken to. You've forgotten your place. But don't worry, I'll soon remind you." The threat hung heavy in the air, palpable and terrifying. Elias felt a surge of protective fury so intense it nearly choked him. He had seen the evidence of Blackwood's cruelty on Alara's body, heard it in the nightmares she still sometimes suffered. This man was the embodiment of the evil that had nearly destroyed her. "Papers or no papers," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "you will not lay a hand on her. You will not speak to her in that manner. And you will leave my property." Now Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He was clearly unaccustomed to being defied. "You're making a mistake, rancher. Interfering in my affairs. The law is on my side. This town, Redemption Gulch, I hear it respects the law." He was trying to appeal to a sense of order, to paint Elias as the one in the wrong. "I respect justice, Mr. Blackwood," Elias countered. "And what you're describing sounds a far cry from it. A piece of paper doesn't give you the right to abuse another human being." "Abuse?" Blackwood feigned surprise. "I was providing discipline. She's willful, defiant. Needs a firm hand." His gaze raked over Alara again, possessive and cruel. "She'll be coming with me." Today Alara let out a small sob, shaking her head violently, her eyes pleading with Elias. "No. Please, Mr. Thorne, don't let him take me. Please." The raw desperation in her voice tore at Elias's heart. He looked at her, at the terror that had her in its grip, and his resolve hardened into granite. He had not saved her from the storm only to hand her back to the monster who had cast her into it. "She's not going anywhere with you, Blackwood," Elias declared, his stance unwavering. Jebediah, who had approached silently from the stables, now stood a few paces behind Elias, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. His weathered face was grim, his loyalty to Elias absolute. Blackwood's eyes flickered towards Jebediah, then back to Elias. He was outnumbered, but his arrogance remained undiminished. "You'll regret this, Thorne. I'll go to the sheriff. I'll see you charged with harboring a runaway with theft." "I'll ruin you." "The sheriff is a fair man," Elias replied evenly. "He'll hear both sides. And I trust he'll see the truth." He knew, however, that legal documents, however unethically obtained, could carry weight. The fight might not end here, on his land. It might have to be fought in the town, before the eyes of the community. "Then we'll let the sheriff decide," Blackwood sneered. "I'll be back. And when I return, I expect her to be ready. Don't make this harder on yourself, Alara. Or on your benefactor." He cast a last, venomous look at Alara, then turned, mounted his horse with a chilling grace, and rode away, not fast, but with an air of absolute confidence, as if his victory were already assured. As his figure receded down the road, Alara collapsed against Martha, her body racked with sobs. The brief, fragile piece of thorn crest had been shattered. The past had not just cast a shadow, it had arrived with a name, a face, and a cruel, legalistic claim. Elias watched Blackwood go, a cold dread settling in his heart, but also a fierce, unyielding determination. This was far from over. The confrontation had been but the first skirmish in a war for Alara's soul, for her freedom. And Elias Thorne, the righteous savior, the lonely rancher with a heart full of unexpected love, was prepared to fight it with every fiber of his being. The sanctuary had been breached, but it had not yet fallen. The departure of Silas Blackwood left an oppressive silence in its wake, thick with fear and uncertainty. Alara trembled uncontrollably in Martha's embrace, the terror Blackwood had instilled in her resurfacing with a vengeance, threatening to pull her back into the dark abyss from which she had so painstakingly climbed. Her sobs were raw, heartbroken sounds that echoed the desolation he had brought back into her life. Elias's jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes still fixed on the empty road where Blackwood had disappeared. The man's confident threat, "I'll be back," hung in the air like a poisonous vapor. "He can't take me, Mr. Thorne," Alara choked out between sobs, her face buried in Martha's apron. "Please, don't let him. I'd rather die." The desperation in her voice was a knife to Elias's heart. He turned, his expression softening as he looked at her, though the steel remained in his eyes. He knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his own. His touch was firm, reassuring. "Alara, listen to me." He waited until her tear-filled eyes met his. "He will not take you. I give you my word. No matter what those papers say, no matter what threats he makes, you are safe here. We will fight him." His voice was imbued with a conviction that brooked no argument. It was a solemn vow made not just to her, but to himself, to the memory of Mary, to the very principles that guided his life. A person was not property. Dignity was not a privilege but a right. Martha, her own eyes moist, stroked Alara's hair. "He's right, child. Mr. Thorne won't let that devil lay a hand on you. None of us will." Jebediah, who had remained a silent, watchful presence, nodded his agreement, his hand still resting reassuringly on the butt of his pistol. "That Blackwood fella ain't reckoned on the loyalty of Thorncrest, ma'am," he said, his gruff voice unusually gentle. Alara looked from Elias to Martha to Jebediah, seeing the unwavering support in their faces. A tiny flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, began to push back against the overwhelming tide of fear. "But his papers," she whispered, the legal threats still looming large in her mind. "He said the law." "The law can be a complicated thing," Elias said, rising. "Sometimes it's just, and sometimes it's used to justify wickedness. We need to be prepared. He'll go to Sheriff Brody, that much is certain." He paced for a moment, his mind already working, formulating a plan. "Jeb, I want you to ride into Redemption Gulch. Find Sheriff Brody. Tell him what happened here. Tell him Blackwood is on his way, likely with a story designed to paint himself as the victim. I want the sheriff to hear our side first, or at least know there is another side. And ask Doc Miller to meet me here as soon as he can. His testimony about your condition when I found you will be crucial." Jebediah nodded. "Right away, Mr. Thorne." He was gone in moments, riding hard for town. Elias then turned his attention back to Alara. "We need to talk, Alara. Properly. I know it's painful, but I need to understand everything about this indenture. About Blackwood. The more I know, the better I can protect you." He led her gently towards the house, Martha still by her side. They sat in the main room, the fire crackling in the hearth, a small pocket of warmth against the chill that Blackwood's presence had left behind. With much hesitation and many tears, Alara began to tell her story. She spoke of her parents' deaths from influenza when she was barely 16, leaving her orphaned and alone. Silas Blackwood, a distant cousin her father had unwisely trusted in business, had appeared shortly after, producing a hastily scribbled document he claimed was a loan agreement with Alara herself as collateral for her father's supposed debts. He had taken her to his isolated estate far to the east, a place of shadows and fear. Her life there had been one of unremitting drudgery and cruelty. She was starved, beaten for the smallest perceived infraction, treated as less than human. The indenture was a thinly veiled slavery. She spoke of his cold, possessive nature, his enjoyment of her fear, the way he seemed to derive pleasure from breaking her spirit. The silver locket, her mother's last gift, was the one thing she had managed to keep hidden, a tiny symbol of a life and a love that Blackwood could not touch. Her escape had been desperate, impulsive, seizing a moment when Blackwood was away on business. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and the locket, traveling for weeks, sleeping in ditches, begging for scraps, always looking over her shoulder, until finally, exhausted and ill, she had collapsed at the Redemption Gulch station, succumbing to the blizzard and her own despair. As she spoke, her voice raw with remembered pain, Elias listened, his heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and a burning rage. Martha wept quietly, her hand never leaving Alara's. The story painted a picture of calculated, monstrous cruelty, of a man utterly devoid of compassion or morality. When Alara finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Elias finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "No court, no sheriff, no piece of paper can make what he did to you right, Alara. That wasn't an indenture, it was a cage. And you had every right to escape it." Doc Miller arrived a few hours later, his face grim as Elias recounted Blackwood's visit, and Alara, with newfound courage bolstered by Elias's support, haltingly corroborated the details of her abuse. The doctor's examination of her lingering scars, both old and newer, though faded, provided stark, physical evidence. "I'll testify to it all, Thorne," Doc Miller said, his voice firm. "I'll tell Sheriff Brody exactly what I saw when you brought her in, what I see now. That man Blackwood is a viper. Those papers of his, they might look legal on the surface, but they're built on a foundation of lies and brutality." The wait for Sheriff Brody was fraught with tension. Alara was visibly on edge, starting at every sound, her eyes constantly darting towards the windows. Elias stayed close, his presence a reassuring bulwark against her fear. He spoke to her of courage, not as the absence of fear, but as the act of facing it. He reminded her of her own strength, the resilience that had brought her this far. Late in the afternoon, Sheriff Brody arrived, not with Blackwood, but alone. He was a tall, weathered man, his face stern but his eyes holding a measure of fairness. He listened patiently as Elias laid out the situation, as Alara, her voice trembling but clear, told her story again, and as Doc Miller provided his medical testimony. Blackwood had indeed been to see him, the sheriff confirmed, full of righteous indignation and brandishing his legal document. "His story is compelling on the surface, Thorne," Sheriff Brody admitted, his gaze steady. "The law on indenture is clear, even if it's a practice I personally find distasteful. He claims she's his property until her debt is paid." Elias's jaw tightened. "And what does your gut tell you, Sheriff, after hearing Alara's testimony, after seeing Doc Miller's evidence?" Sheriff Brody was silent for a long moment, his gaze resting on Alara's pale, earnest face, then on the resolute determination in Elias's eyes. "My gut tells me there's more to this than a simple contract, Thorne. It tells me this girl has seen hell. But my gut ain't proof in a court of law," he sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Blackwood is demanding I enforce his claim. He's threatening to bring in federal marshals if I don't." This was the confrontation Elias had feared, the clash between cold legality and moral justice. The stand would have to be made, not just with words but with unwavering resolve. "She is not property, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice ringing with conviction. "She is a human being who has been grievously wronged, and I will not stand by and see her return to her tormentor. Whatever the cost." The air in the room crackled with tension. The climax of their struggle was upon them. The fate of Alara, her very freedom, hung in the balance, dependent on the courage of those who stood with her against the encroaching darkness. Sheriff Brody rubbed his temples, the weight of his office and the moral dilemma before him etched onto his face. "Thorne, you know I respect you. You're an upright man. But Blackwood's papers, they appear legitimate. If I ignore a legal claim, even one that smells as bad as this, it sets a dangerous precedent. The law has to be upheld or there's chaos." Elias met the sheriff's gaze, unblinking. "And is it not chaos, Sheriff, when the law is twisted to become an instrument of torture and enslavement? Is it not chaos when a man can buy and brutalize another human being under the guise of a contract? What is the purpose of the law if not to protect the innocent and punish the wicked?" Alara, drawing strength from Elias's unwavering defense, straightened her shoulders. Her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly firm, devoid of the earlier tremor. "Sheriff Brody, that man, Silas Blackwood, he did not just make me work. He tried to break me. He took pleasure in my pain. If I go back with him, I will not survive. I know it." She touched the locket at her throat. "This was my mother's. It's the only thing I have left of my family. He tried to take it from me many times. He said it was a trinket, a distraction from my duties." Doc Miller chimed in, his voice gruff. "Brody, I've seen my share of hardship cases on this frontier. I've seen accidents, illnesses, the results of foolish choices. What I saw on that girl when Thorne brought her in was different. That was calculated, sustained cruelty. Those weren't the marks of an unruly servant being disciplined. Those were the marks of a soul being systematically crushed." Sheriff Brody looked from Alara's earnest, pleading face to Doc Miller's adamant expression and then to Elias, whose quiet determination was as solid as the mountains ringing the valley. He knew Thorne, knew him to be a man of his word, a man who had suffered his own great losses but had never lost his moral compass. He also knew that Redemption Gulch, while a frontier town, prided itself on a certain decency. Blackwood is waiting down at the hotel, the sheriff said finally. He expects me to return with the girl. He's made it clear he'll make a formal complaint to the territorial governor if I fail in my duty. Elias stepped closer. Then let us go to town, Sheriff. Let Alara tell her story not just to you, but to the community. Let them see Silas Blackwood for who he is. Let them see Alara for who she is, a survivor, not a piece of property. Redemption Gulch can decide what kind of justice it stands for. It was a bold move, a gamble. Public opinion could be a fickle thing. But Elias believed in the fundamental decency of his neighbors, believed that when faced with the stark truth, they would choose compassion over cold legalism. Sheriff Brody considered this. It was unorthodox. But perhaps it was the only way. All right, Thorne, he said slowly. We'll do it your way. We'll convene an informal hearing at the town hall. Blackwood can present his claim. And Alara, she can present hers. Let the town bear witness. A wave of relief washed over Alara. So potent she swayed slightly. Martha was instantly by her side, a steadying arm around her shoulders. Elias gave a curt nod. Thank you, Sheriff. The journey into Redemption Gulch was tense. Elias rode beside the buckboard where Alara sat with Martha, his hand never far from his sidearm. Jebediah followed, a silent, watchful guardian. As they approached the town, word of the impending confrontation had clearly spread. Faces peered from windows, and small groups gathered on the boardwalks, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The town hall, a simple wooden structure, was already crowded when they arrived. Silas Blackwood stood at the front, near the makeshift dais where Sheriff Brody would preside. Blackwood's expression was one of smug confidence, his expensive clothes a stark contrast to the rough-hewn attire of most of the townsfolk. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, tapping them impatiently. Sheriff Brody called the impromptu assembly to order. He explained the situation briefly, neutrally, then called on Silas Blackwood to state his claim. Blackwood stepped forward, his voice smooth and persuasive. He spoke of broken contracts, of runaway servants, of the sanctity of legal agreements. He painted Alara as deceitful and ungrateful, a financial burden he had charitably taken on, only to be betrayed. He waved his papers, emphasizing their legal authority. The crowd listened, some nodding, others looking uncertain. The power of a written document of the law was strong. Then it was Alara's turn. She was pale, her hands trembling, but as she looked at Elias, who gave her an encouraging nod, a spark of defiance ignited in her eyes. She stepped forward, her small figure dwarfed by the hall, but her voice, when she began to speak, was clear and carried through the room. She did not raise her voice, did not resort to hysterics. She simply told her truth. She described her life under Blackwood's care, the hunger, the cold, the endless work, the casual brutality, the soul-crushing despair. She spoke of her fear, but also of her desperate yearning for freedom, for dignity. As she spoke, a hush fell over the room. Her words, simple and direct, painted a vivid picture of suffering that no legal document could erase. She held up her mother's locket. "This is all I have," she said, her voice catching. "He tried to take this too. Because he wanted to own all of me, even my memories." When she finished, there was a profound silence. Then Doc Miller stepped forward, corroborating her account with his medical findings, his words carrying the weight of his respected position in the community. Finally, Elias spoke. He did not challenge the legality of the papers directly. Instead, he spoke of a higher law, the law of human decency, of compassion. "This young woman," he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd, "was found near death on a winter's night, abandoned and frozen. She was brought back to life by kindness and care. She has shown herself to be gentle, hardworking, and possessed of a brave spirit. Is this the action of a deceitful runaway? Or is it the act of someone fleeing an unbearable evil?" He turned to Blackwood, his voice like steel. "Mr. Blackwood, you claim ownership, but a human soul cannot be owned. A life cannot be bartered like chattel. What you call an indenture, this community might call by another name." A murmur ran through the crowd. Faces that had been uncertain now hardened with indignation. The tide was turning. Blackwood, seeing his advantage slipping, blustered. "This is an outrage. An emotional spectacle. The law is the law. Sheriff, I demand you enforce my claim." Sheriff Brody looked at Blackwood, then at Alara, then at the faces of his community. He saw their dawning understanding, their revulsion. He made his decision. "Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff said, his voice firm, "while your papers may have the appearance of legality, the testimony we have heard today paints a very different picture. a picture of profound abuse and cruelty. This community will not be party to returning Miss Alara to such a situation. A cheer went up from the crowd. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. You haven't heard the last of this, Brody. Or you, Thorn, he snarled. I'll see you all ruined. He stormed out of the town hall, pushing through the now hostile crowd, his threats lost in the rising murmur of approval for the sheriff's decision. Elias moved to Alara's side, taking her hand. It was still trembling, but her eyes were shining with tears of relief, of disbelief. It's over, Alara, he said softly. You're free. The townspeople surged forward, offering words of support, of welcome. Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress, hugged Alara fiercely. Even men who Elias knew to be hard-nosed and pragmatic came to shake his hand, their respect evident. Redemption Gulch had faced a moral test, and it had chosen compassion. The law had been challenged by justice, and justice, this day, had prevailed. The shadow of Silas Blackwood had been banished, not by force of arms, but by the courage of a young woman to speak her truth, and the willingness of a community to listen. Alara was truly, finally, safe. The sanctuary of Thorncrest had not only held, it had extended its protection outward, and in doing so, had reaffirmed the best of what a community could be. The ride back to Thorncrest Ranch was markedly different from the tense journey into town. A sense of profound relief, almost giddiness, permeated the small group. Alara, seated beside Martha in the buckboard, no longer looked like a hunted animal. The lines of fear around her eyes had softened, replaced by an expression of exhausted but radiant hope. She still clutched her mother's locket, but now it seemed less like a desperate talisman and more like a cherished link to a past she could begin to reconcile with a future that was, for the first time in so long, truly her own. Elias rode alongside, the grim set of his jaw replaced by a quiet satisfaction. He had faced down a formidable evil, not with violence, but with conviction and faith in the goodness of others. He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that a heavy burden had been lifted, not just from Alara but from his own solitary existence. The people of Redemption Gulch had surprised him. He had known them as hardworking, sometimes stubborn, frontier folk. He hadn't fully anticipated the depth of their compassion when faced with such a stark moral choice. Their support had been a crucial turning point, a testament to the power of community when rallied for a just cause. As they crested the rise that overlooked the ranch, bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, Thorncrest looked more like a sanctuary than ever before. It was a place where healing had taken root, where a broken spirit had been mended, and where a new family forged in adversity had solidified its bonds. Martha was humming a cheerful, off-key tune, her arm around Alara's shoulders. Jebediah, riding a little behind, even permitted himself a small, rare smile. Upon their arrival, the usual quiet of the ranch was broken by a small, spontaneous celebration. Martha insisted on preparing a special supper, and even Elias found himself sharing stories and laughter with an ease that had long been absent. Alara, though still tired from the emotional ordeal, seemed to glow from within. She moved with a newfound confidence, her smiles less hesitant, her voice clearer. That evening, after the meal, as the three of them, Elias, Martha, and Alara, sat before the fire, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was the silence of shared victory, of unspoken understanding. Alara finally broke the quiet, her voice soft but steady. Mr. Thorne, she began, turning to him, her violet eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life more than once. You gave me back my freedom, my dignity. Elias met her gaze, his own eyes gentle. Alara, you showed incredible courage today. You saved yourself. All Martha and I did was provide a safe harbor for you to find that strength. This is more than a safe harbor, Mr. Thorne, Alara said, her gaze encompassing Martha as well. This is home. If you'll still have me. Martha's eyes welled up. Oh, child, she said, her voice thick with emotion, of course, we'll have you. This wouldn't be home without you now. Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so profound it almost overwhelmed him. He had set out to rescue a stranger, and in doing so, had found something akin to the family he thought he had lost forever. Thorncrest is your home for as long as you wish it to be, Alara, he said, his voice husky. You belong here. Her smile was like the dawn. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you both. In the days and weeks that followed, a new sense of peace settled over Thorncrest. The threat of Silas Blackwood, though he had vowed revenge, seemed to recede into the distance. Sheriff Brody had assured Elias that Blackwood had left the territory muttering threats but ultimately powerless against a united community and a sheriff who now viewed his claims with deep suspicion. The locket, Alara's constant companion, finally yielded its secret. One evening, as she was idly fiddling with it, a tiny, almost invisible catch gave way and the locket sprang open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of a kind-faced woman with eyes as violet as Alara's own, her mother. On the other, nestled beneath a protective layer of glass, was a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Alara unfolded it. It contained a few lines of verse in a delicate hand, a mother's blessing and a prayer for her daughter's happiness and safety. And at the bottom, almost too small to read, was a name and a location, your Aunt Maeve, Willow Creek Valley, Oregon Territory. Tears streamed down Alara's face as she read it. It was a tangible link, a forgotten branch of her family tree. She showed it to Elias and Martha, her voice choked with emotion. I have family. I never knew. Elias examined the note. Willow Creek Valley, he mused. That's a long journey from here, but not an impossible one. A new question hung in the air. Would Alara seek out this unknown aunt? Would she leave Thorncrest now that a potential blood relative had been discovered? Alara looked around the warm, familiar room, at Martha's kindly face, at Elias's steady, reassuring presence. She thought of the fear and desolation she had known before and the peace and belonging she had found here. Perhaps one day, she said softly, I will try to find her. To know her. But not yet. She closed the locket, a new sense of completeness settling over her. For now, she said, her gaze meeting Elias's, a soft smile on her lips, my family is here. This is where I belong. Elias's heart swelled. He understood her choice. Family was not just about blood, it was about love, loyalty, and shared experience. It was about chosen bonds. And the bonds that tied Alara to Thorncrest and to him and Martha were strong and true. The coming winter held no fear for her now. She had faced the worst of storms, both literal and metaphorical, and had emerged stronger, her spirit unbent. The new family, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by kindness, was ready to face whatever the future held together. The chapter of Silas Blackwood was closed, and a new one, full of hope and promise, was just beginning for Alara and for the lonely rancher who had found her frozen at the station and, in doing so, had rediscovered the warmth of a loving home. Many years passed, seasons turning one into another, each leaving its mark on the land and the lives at Thorncrest Ranch. The vibrant greens of spring gave way to the golden hues of summer, followed by the russet and crimson of autumn, and then the pristine white blanket of winter, year after year, in a comforting and enduring cycle. Thorncrest prospered, not just in cattle and crops, but in a deeper, more meaningful way. It became renowned throughout the territory not only for the quality of its livestock but as a place of unwavering integrity and quiet generosity, a reflection of the man who was its heart and the remarkable young woman who had become its soul. Alara, no longer the frightened girl found at the station, blossomed into a confident, compassionate woman. The shadows of her past, though never entirely erased, no longer held dominion over her. They had become, instead, a source of profound empathy, fueling a quiet determination to help others who had suffered. She never did seek out her Aunt Maeve in Oregon. The discovery of the locket's message had brought a sense of peace, a connection to her roots, but Thorncrest was her true north, Elias and Martha her true family. She found her calling on the ranch, working alongside Elias, her keen intellect and gentle spirit proving invaluable. She had a particular gift with animals, her calm presence soothing even the most skittish colt, her knowledge of herbal remedies often more effective than any store-bought medicine. The garden flourished under her care, providing not only for their own table but also for many families in Redemption Gulch who fell on hard times. Martha, her hair now entirely silver, remained the warm heart of the household, her wisdom and kindness a constant comfort. She watched Alara and Elias with a knowing smile, seeing the deep, unspoken affection that bound them, a bond that had transcended that of rescuer and rescued, evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a quiet, profound love. Elias Thorne, the once solitary widower, found his life immeasurably enriched. The loneliness that had once been his constant companion was a distant memory. In Alara he had found not just a daughter figure, but a partner in every sense of the word. Her laughter filled the halls of the ranch house, her intelligence sharpened his own business dealings, and her compassion softened the lingering edges of his old grief. Theirs was a love story written not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet everyday moments, shared glances over the dinner table, comfortable silences on the porch swing, the easy rhythm of working side by side, united in purpose. The town of Redemption Gulch, too, had been changed by their story. The dramatic confrontation with Silas Blackwood had served as a moral touchstone, a reminder that justice and compassion were not abstract ideals but living principles that required courage and conviction. Alara, with her quiet grace and unwavering spirit, became an inspiration. She and Elias established a small fund supported by the ranch's prosperity to aid newcomers to the territory, particularly women and children who arrived alone or in difficult circumstances. They never sought recognition for their charitable acts, but their kindness became legendary, a quiet force for good that rippled outwards. The legacy of that frozen night at the station was not one of fear and despair, but of hope and transformation. It was a testament to the power of a single act of kindness to change not just one life, but many. As the years mellowed into decades, Elias Thorne watched his Ilara move through the world with a quiet strength and an unshakable grace. He saw in her eyes the reflection of the love that had healed her, the love that had, in turn, healed him. The memory of Mary and his infant son was no longer a source of sharp pain, but a gentle, bittersweet ache, their love woven into the fabric of the new life he had built. A life made whole again by the unexpected arrival of a frozen girl who had thawed his heart and brought an enduring spring to Thorne Crest. Their story became a local legend, a tale told around campfires and hearths, a reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, human kindness could blossom, that chosen families could be as strong, if not stronger, than those forged by blood, and that second chances were not just possible but could lead to a richness of life beyond imagining. The shock that Elias Thorne's actions had initially sent through Redemption Gulch had long since faded, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. What he did that fateful night, and in all the days and years that followed, was a testament to the enduring power of a righteous heart and the transformative magic of unwavering love. Thorne Crest Ranch stood as a beacon, a symbol of hope and sanctuary, its legacy etched not in stone, but in the countless lives touched by the kindness that had begun with a single, desperate discovery at a frozen train station. And so, the story of the rich cowboy and the frozen girl lived on, a timeless tale of rescue, resilience, and the enduring power of a love that defied the odds and changed a whole town and a whole world for the better.